Stand up against the rights removal bill. We've spoken about this on the Elevate podcast and the Pandemic podcast before, but in the United Kingdom right now, our human rights are under threat. This isn't just from the authoritarian rule that we've witnessed over the last couple of years. This is in actual legislation whereby the British government is seeking to remove the Human Rights Act and replace it with what we are calling the Rights Removal Bill. Now, the government plans to rip up the Human Rights Act means fewer rights for us and more power for them. If enough of us take a stand, then we can stop them. Now, there's many different campaigns and activities taking place, but this weekend in London, there is going to be a human rights rally starting at 1 p.m. from Speaker's Corner. I'll be there representing Elevate, recording, as always, the footage from the day and taking part in the rally. This is a critical time because it's not just the Human Rights Act. We've got the Online Safety Bill, we've got the Schools Bill, the Public Order Bill, the Online Harms Bill, the Economic Crimes Bill, the Genetic Modification Bill, the Higher Education Bill. There's just an enormous amount of legislation coming through that threaten our rights in the UK. And this, quite frankly, unfortunately, is not abnormal. After a crisis like this, it's history shows us that those in power will take the opportunity to continue to bolster and enforce that power. So it's critical that we take a stand. Now, in a functioning democracy, people must be able to hold the powerful to account. For more than 20 years now, the Human Rights Act has enabled everyone in the UK to do just that and to stand up for our rights when public authorities like the government, local councils fall short. Now, what it does is it protects us from misuse of that power, no matter who we are. Individual citizens, whether we're businesses, whether we represent a minority, it represents all of our rights here in the UK. But the government plans to rip up this Human Rights Act and replace it with a so-called British Bill of Rights that only protects the powerful. Now, the idea of a Bill of Rights in principle is not unfavorable, but the way in which this government is constructing it will do it in a way that weakens your rights, and it'll make it harder for ordinary people to get justice, and it'll make it easier for public authorities to ignore their responsibilities to respect and protect your rights. The government is attempting to cut off all the avenues that people have to hold the powerful accountable for their actions, and it's given the police more power than ever before to shut down protests. It's making it harder for people to challenge government decision-making, and it's blocking people without ID to vote in elections. We can't let our Human Rights Act be scrapped. It's important that we stand up now to save our rights. So I hope that you'll join us this Saturday in London. I hope it's going to be beautiful weather. It looks like the forecast is pretty decent to walk through London and raise this important issue, because right now Britain is sleepwalking through these challenges. We've had these challenges with COVID. We've now had the war in Ukraine dominating our headlines. All of these pieces of legislation and bills are slipping under the radar under the guise of these wider problems. Now, we cannot allow ourselves to sleepwalk into giving away our rights. And unfortunately, many people are not awake to what's happening in the world right now. But the good news is, I suppose, is it doesn't take the entire population to take a stand. It takes a courageous few. And I invite you to be one of those courageous few and join us in London this weekend to take a stand if you can. Otherwise, if you are unable to join us in London, then you can check out the Liberty. I would recommend checking out the Liberty campaign right now and signing the petition, which is close to 100,000 signatures. But it's also important to note, as we go to protest this weekend, just this week, the new provisions, the new public order provisions in the police bill that came into effect in April now came into force from the 28th of June. So that means this weekend, when the protests are taking place, we are now subject to these new police bill public order provisions. And I'm going to try and take you through some of these right now so you can get up to speed on what this actually means and how it affects our right to protest, not only this weekend, but on an ongoing basis. Now, what the government have done have actually created a new definition of disruption, which makes it incredibly vague to define what constitutes and what qualifies as disruption. Therefore, we're now at greater risk of being caught up by this highly subjective definition by police officers, which limits our freedom to protest. And of course, by their very nature, if one is forced to take upon protesting, it's usually because other methods have failed to reach a critical mass, and the government is still, or the authorities are still not paying attention. So to require a protest often requires disruptive means to get attention. That can cause unfortunate disruption for those around us, but sometimes those issues are so important that we must be able to take a stand. Now, there's all kinds of other changes in the public order within the police bill, looking at noise. So again, this disruption, being noisy is historically, even though they're peaceful by by nature, noise, instruments, drums, chanting, all of these things have played a role within previous protests. And now there's noise limitations, which again are highly subjective and could lead to police shutting down a protest. So these changes in definition when it comes to disruption and noise mean it's incredibly vague now when it comes to understanding what you can and cannot do. And it really gives the police power to shut down a protest on a whim. And it's interesting, London, the capital, is always the kind of melting pot of protest activity. This weekend, alongside the human rights protest, there's the Pride rally. And again, what's interesting about these things, as we've seen before, is that the policing is often political, in the sense that the order comes in from high to shut down the anti-lockdown protests, whilst climate protests or Black Lives Matter protests can continue. Similarly, this weekend, I'm sure, again, as always, it'll be a peaceful human rights rally. But at the same time, there's the Pride rally. And how will these be policed? Will they be policed differently? Is one cause seen as more socially acceptable than the other? Is one rallying against the government seen to be more disruptive and therefore subject to higher police activity? These subjective natures, the subjective nature of this bill makes it incredibly difficult for protesters to know their rights. Now, there's also a restriction on static demos. So the previous legislation, if you had a static demo, a rally where you had speakers, for instance, versus a march where you're on the move, these were treated separately, often recognizing that static demos are more relaxed. It doesn't cause as much disruption and noise going through city centers, etc. But now under the new bill, they're treated as the same. So now the police can actually impose stricter restrictions on static demos that are historically less disruptive than the moving marches. Not only this, now previously a static demo was defined as 2 or more people publicly protesting. Now it's down to one individual. So if you're a lone wolf protesting, speaking up for your rights, now you can be subject to the powers that be as a standalone protester. And let's be honest, we've all seen standalone protesters who have taken to the streets to voice their frustration about what's happening in the world. Now they're always less likely to be as disruptive, but nonetheless, the police now have more powers to punish even those protesting by themselves. But what this means, you could be seen around a protest and associated with a protest, and all of a sudden you are subject to the same laws and the same punishments that others who may have been part of a much wider disruptive protest at the same time. Now, of course, people always say when you're protesting, you've got to go to the centers of power. Well, Parliament is one of those centers of power. There are certain restricted areas outside Parliament that always have been, but now those restrictions around Parliament have been imposed and extended, further imposed and further extended, making it even harder to actually make your voice heard to the groups of people who need the decision makers to hear the protest. There's greater powers again for ministers to interfere. And in terms of protest offences, the punishments have extended widely. Previously, a protest organizer could face up to 3 months in prison or a fine up to $2,500. It's now up to nearly a year, 51 weeks in prison, and again a fine up to $2,500. Attending a protest and breaching a condition imposed by the police previously led up to a fine of £1,000. Now it's a fine of up to £2,500, whether you knew the rights or not. And further, now the latter point, inciting another person to attend a protest and breach a condition that's imposed by police now faces, again, rather than 3 months in prison and a large fine, it's now 51 weeks. So by inciting others to attend a protest and breach a condition leads to a rather long and hefty punishment. So in all, the vagaries around the bill, the strengthening of police powers means that the right to protest is seriously under threat. Now, the right to protest in itself is a fundamental building block of democracy. It's a fundamental human right. And without these rights, well, our powers rapidly slip away. So we've got a multitude of issues to tackle here. And as always, it feels like a kind of game of whack-a-mole where we've got multiple bills arising at once, which makes it incredibly difficult to organize, incredibly difficult to tackle, because there is so much frenzy around the particular issues that show up. So it's my hope, at least, by attending this protest, I can take a stand against many of these new bills that are coming forth. This is government overreach. This is government overextending into our life. This is authority overextending into our life. This is a proxy for a power grab by our incumbent government, and it's essential that we, the people, the citizens of this country, take a stand. So I invite you to join us this weekend in London. I believe the meeting point is at 1 p.m. at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park for the Human Rights Rally. I look forward to marching through the streets of London and taking a stand for my human rights, but not just my human rights, all of our human rights, including our right to protest. So I hope to see some of you there. Let me know in the comments if you're coming. And if you are coming and you want to hook up with our community, come and join us inside the Elevate Network. We've got a event page there where you can RSVP and let us know that you're coming, and we can meet up on the day. So just go over to weareelevate.org if you'd like to join up with our community and our crew. But it's going to be a beautiful weekend. Let's go and peacefully take a stand, and let's reclaim the power and show this government that we will not go silently as they attempt to rip away our powers. We will stand strong and reclaim our power. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a wonderful weekend, whatever you do. I hope to see you in London. Peace out for now. Thanks again. See you next week.